It was a much more honest system, and it was totally independent. But practically now, the Federal Reserve really acts as an arm of the government, I think in violation of the act, and pretty much does whatever the government wants. And they simply facilitate deficit spending. And, you see the Secretary of the Treasury and the Federal Chairman of the Fed, they're all buddy-buddy. They're having joint press conferences. They're talking all the time. They're coordinating policy. They're working hand in glove. I mean, that this is not supposed to be. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be a check on the government, not an enabler of government, which is what it's become, which is why the whole system is going to collapse.
Back to the Fed printing money and stuff. So what's the relationship between the Federal Reserve and the federal government? Because I know they started out, it was supposed to be two separate entities, independent of each other. But what does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
Well, they still are in theory.
Yeah.
I don't know if you get a letter from a U.S. government agency, like you get a letter from the IRS, they don't go and buy a stamp at the post office, right? They get to frank it. They get to send their mail for free, right? Because the U.S. government owns the post office, right? But when you get a letter from the Federal Reserve, they have to buy a stamp and put it on there because the Federal Reserve is not part of the U.S. government. So they have to buy postage. It is an independent, private organization. Now, there are some public aspects of it where the board of governors get appointed by the government and the chairman is appointed, right? But the banks, all those member banks, they're not part of the government. And the reason that the Federal Reserve was originally created through the Federal Reserve Act as an independent company, which, by the way, pays taxes. The Federal Reserve pays taxes to the U.S. government. It has a very high rate. It has like 100% rate of tax after it makes a certain amount of profit. But it is a tax. I mean, legally, it's a tax. And the reason this was done was because the Constitution does not authorize the federal government to print money. So the federal government could not issue paper currency. That's why the Federal Reserve is doing it, because it's not the federal government. But they also wanted to keep it separate for a lot of reasons. I mean, they didn't want the government just going into debt and printing money. That's why the original Federal Reserve Act said the Federal Reserve couldn't even hold or buy U.S. Treasury bonds. And of course, the original Federal Reserve notes were backed 100% by commercial paper, which was the notes of other banks, and 40% by gold. So, and the gold was real money. So the Federal Reserve notes were not money. They were money substitutes. They were IOUs, but dollars were the actual gold that the Federal Reserve held. Federal Reserve notes were not dollars. They were IOUs for dollars. The dollars were made of gold, and the Federal Reserve kept them in their vaults. So it was a much more honest system, and it was totally independent. But practically now, the Federal Reserve really acts as an arm of the government, I think in violation of the act, and pretty much does whatever the government wants.
Yeah.
And they simply facilitate deficit spending. And, you see the Secretary of the Treasury and the Federal Chairman of the Fed, they're all buddy-buddy. They're having joint press conferences. They're talking all the time. They're coordinating policy. They're working hand in glove. I mean, that this is not supposed to be. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be a check on the government, not an enabler of government, which is what it's become, which is why the whole system is going to collapse.
Right. Do you think we should have a Federal Reserve?
Ideally, I don't think we need one. I mean, if you go back to the original rationale for a Fed, I mean, I can see the argument back in 1913 about why the Federal Reserve System may have been an improvement on the system that we had before. But the problem isn't the way the Federal Reserve was in its initial form. The problem was what it evolved into once the government got the camel's nose under the tent. So for that reason, I would just say, no, we cannot give the government an inch, even if we benefit from that inch, because they'll take a mile and we are going to suffer as a result of that. So whatever good may have been accomplished for the first year with the Federal Reserve Act, I mean, they quickly undid it. So no, I think we'd be better off just getting rid of the Fed. But we also have to make sure that the federal government doesn't just start doing what the Fed was doing. Because 100 years ago, there was a lot more respect for the Constitution than there is now. So we needed a Federal Reserve Act back in 1913 because we all knew that the federal government didn't have the power to print money. But we don't know that now. Today, we think the federal government can do whatever the hell it wants. Remember, in 1913, when the federal government wanted to tax income, they had to amend the Constitution because people were smart enough to say, hey, wait a minute, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can tax our income. So they had to change the Constitution, right? So, but now whenever they want to tax, they just do it. So the danger of getting rid of the Federal Reserve is that we just get rid of the Fed and just replace it with something worse, which is the government doing what the Fed was doing, only worse. So we have to get rid of the Fed, but we also have to make sure that the federal government doesn't assume its powers. We need to go back to the system that we had prior to the Federal Reserve, which was private banks issuing their own currency backed by gold, gold and silver.
I just don't see the public being aware enough to like support anything like that unless we have a massive crash or something.
Well, yeah. Well, they're not going to support it until, they're living with the consequences of, runaway inflation or hopefully not hyperinflation. But yeah, I mean, things are going to get really bad, and that might be a catalyst for change. Of course, it could be a catalyst for negative change. I mean, look what happened in Germany. They had hyperinflation, and that laid the foundation for, Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich.
Yeah.
Right? Now, after that collapse, they went to something much better, at least Western Germany. The East Germans got stuff with the Soviet bloc, and so they went to communism, but West Germany went in a different direction and became a very wealthy, prosperous civilization over there. But so, yeah, I mean, hyperinflation definitely leads to political change, but it doesn't have to be for the better. It could be for the worse. So that's a real risk.
So for those of you that don't know, in business circles, there's a very popular and notorious book called The Creature from Jekyll Island about the founding of the Federal Reserve, how a bunch of bankers got together, secret meeting, created the Federal Reserve to benefit themselves as like a cartel. What are your thoughts on that? Because the way you explain the founding of the Fed, you don't seem to buy it.
Yeah, look, I don't necessarily think that the people behind the Fed were bad, evil people, and they had bad intentions. It seems to me that it's more likely that they had good intentions. But, I mean, that's what they say about the road to hell. And they say that for a reason, right? That you pave the road to hell with good intentions. So it's not that these were necessarily evil people. I mean, maybe they were, but I think it's more likely that they were not. But the problem was they created something that government could exploit. And then how do you expect government not to exploit it, not to take advantage of it? And even if you think you've built in enough safeguards, like a good example of how this changed very quickly is, so they started the Federal Reserve Act, and they had the good sense in the Federal Reserve Act to say the Federal Reserve cannot hold any U.S. treasuries because they didn't want the Federal Reserve lending money to the U.S. government. They were worried that the government would abuse that if it could borrow from the Federal Reserve. So no, you can't do that. We're not going to let the Federal Reserve loan any money to the federal government. Well, World War I comes along, right? 1917, we get into a war. The government needs money. And, here's the Federal Reserve. Oh, sorry, you can't get it from the Fed. So they introduced a bill to amend the Federal Reserve Act so that now the Federal Reserve can buy U.S. treasuries or hold U.S. treasuries because they wanted to use the Federal Reserve to finance the war. And the war wasn't popular. People didn't even want to go to war, and it was a mistake. We never should have entered World War I. In fact, if we didn't enter World War I, there probably wouldn't have been a World War II, which means there wouldn't have been an Adolf Hitler, because there wouldn't have been a Weimar Republic, because there wouldn't have been a Treaty of Versailles. And, all these terrible things would never have happened had we not gone into World War I. But World War I was not popular, and people didn't want to pay all the high taxes, even though they raised taxes to pay for the war. So they wanted to pay for the war with debt, but they didn't want to borrow it from the public, so they wanted to borrow from the Fed. And so they amended the Federal Reserve Act. But now, here's what happened. So Congress, when they were amending the Federal Reserve Act, in order to enable the Federal Reserve to buy treasuries, they were like, okay, we have to make sure the federal government does not abuse this, right? So they passed the debt ceiling, right? That's where the debt ceiling came from. So the debt ceiling said, this is a limit. This is a ceiling on how much debt the U.S. government can have. So it won't borrow too much money from the Federal Reserve. So they created the debt ceiling. So they thought that they were creating a buffer. Okay, we'll give the Federal Reserve the ability to loan money to the government, but we'll put a ceiling on how much debt the U.S. government's going to have, right? That's going to be our safety valve. Well, we all know what happened to that ceiling. I mean, every time we got near it, we raised it. And now basically the ceiling doesn't even exist anymore. We found a way to legislatively make it disappear without actually voting to repeal it. But the debt is now, the national debt is almost 28 trillion, right? So we've blown through that ceiling, by trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. But again, that's the problem. So we can't give the government anything. So we have to completely get the government out of the business of creating money and printing money, which is what the framers had in mind when they wrote the Constitution. So if the U.S. government wants to pay for something, it needs to get the public to pay for it. So if there's a new government program, they have to raise our taxes to pay for it. And if they can't convince the public to pay higher taxes, well, you know what? We don't want it. Then don't have it, right? That's what we have to go back to. We have to pay for the things that the government says we need.
I hope you enjoyed this clip from our interview with Peter Schiff. Peter is an economist, financial commentator, millionaire stockbroker, and someone that I really like to take into account his opinions, along with people with other differing economic opinions. You can check out the full interview we did together with the link below, where we went over a ton of cool stuff like inflation, hyperinflation, the Fed, the money printer, the dollar crash, capitalism, socialism, democracy, the gold standard, the creature from Jekyll Island, and a ton more. Really great conversation that we have been getting a lot of great feedback on, which you can check out with the link below or on the screen right now. You can subscribe for more dangerous conversations for dangerous minds just like yourselves with the red button below. It's free. You can dislike, unsubscribe, leave us your best hate comments whenever you want, so you might as well do it because you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Check out the other interviews we've done on the screen right now. Stay dangerous out there, and we will see you guys in the next one.